are there no libertarians during a pandemic? So this is a question that's commonly asked by people who have always assumed that libertarianism was stupid and always hated it. At least that's the people who I see who are asking it. It goes to kind of a more general question of, isn't it necessary, at least in some situations, for an activist government to be involved, to at least for utilitarian reasons, to fix problems? Now, it's interesting is the people who say this are typically not minarchists, right? See, these are not people who have a restrained view of government anyway. Most of them believe the government should be involved in all kinds of things that are certainly not emergencies and that are certainly not unusual events, but just as a common everyday thing, they probably support the government running healthcare, running schools, running just about everything. And they always hate libertarianism pretty much, even when this isn't going on, and they just see this kind of as a validating idea. But hypothetically, it's possible to say, well, sure, there's a proper role for government, and maybe it's within certain bounds, but then there could be extraordinary circumstances, say a tsunami or a hurricane, an earthquake, a war, like a serious invasion, or what we have now, this pandemic that's going on with coronavirus, which is looking to be something like a once in a century or once in a 50-year occurrence. That we've seen something this bad in terms of its lethality, a combination of its lethality and its contagiousness. There's certainly diseases that are more lethal, but they're not as contagious. There are diseases that are actually more contagious, but not as lethal. So it's not a perfect storm. This could be a whole lot worse, but even as it stands, this is going to be probably the worst pandemic in at least 15, maybe 100 years, going back to the Spanish flu, most likely. We will see. Still early stages, but that's the way it's looking right now, and it wouldn't surprise me if that's how it ended up. So even though I think that there is a lot of intellectual dishonesty on the point of people who would ask this question, people, again, who assume the government has a big role anyway, I think it is a fair question to ask. How would the market deal with an unexpected event like this, and isn't it necessary to have the state? And then people will point out, well, you need to have somebody who coordinates a kind of massive response. And I think there's two ways to answer that. First of all, that completely ignores any moral arguments against that, right? Just assumes that the state has the right to do it, that we're just doing away with rights. And if that is a general principle, then that applies to everything, right? There's no point in having a Bill of Rights. There's no point in having courts of law and justice. These are things that are just in the hindrances to the implementation of utilitarian policy. All of them are. Having a Fourth Amendment, having a First Amendment, having free speech, having gun rights, obviously. Of course, many people are not going to agree with that anyway. Having any kind of law at all is a detriment to the state, because then if it suddenly becomes consequentially necessary, or at least could be argued to be consequentially necessary to implement a policy, whether it's an emergency or not, having to worry about previous law or judicial review or any of that, any kind of check at all is just a detriment, right? So this is a kind of a principle that goes way, way, way past coronavirus. Now, if you want to say, well, in exceptional situations, and lifeboat scenarios are great hypotheticals to illustrate points. I always like to say, though, that they are lifeboat scenarios and they don't necessarily apply out of lifeboat scenarios. But I'll take the point just for the sake of argument, and perhaps even a valid one, that, well, this is a lifeboat scenario now. Not in the sense that everyone's going to die, but like changes in policy could affect hundreds of thousands of people dying. I mean, even the low ends make it seem like, if 300,000 people die in the United States this year, that's as many people died in the United States from World War II over the course of 4 years. And the thing is, 300,000 seems like a low number. I think it's probably going to be closer to 1 million, which would make it worse than the Civil War. Again, all within 1 year, as opposed to over the course of 4 or 5 years. So that's never mind the people who got sick and who got maimed and whatever else. So you could say, well, this is basically a lifeboat scenario. So I like to kind of, as a juxtaposition here, look at China. So China is where this started, right? And so China is not a libertarian free market society. They have a oppressive totalitarian state. They're a police state. They don't have to follow the rule of law. They can do whatever they want. They can impose whatever draconian measures they feel are necessary. And what's interesting is, and this is illustrative of some of the general points I want to make here in a little bit, is that at first, all right, they deny that there was a problem. They persecuted people who thought that there were problems, people who were speaking out saying we have an issue. They said, no, everything's fine. They put those people in prison. They ostracized them. They told everyone to do what they wanted, and they no doubt helped contribute to the spread of this disease, even if they're innocent in its creation, which is a whole other thing that we could debate about. But then they switched gears and decided they were going to crack down, and they imposed all these really draconian laws. Now, they could have even been more draconian than we know. They could have just started killing people, right? And as far as I know, they didn't do that. And again, if you believe that it's all consequentialism and that rights don't matter and that anything that hinders the state's ability to implement policy, if you decide it's a good policy, then there's no reason why they shouldn't necessarily do that. I mean, you can do the whole cost-benefit analysis. It's very easy once you start applying that logic to say, look, stopping a plague that could kill, let's just say hypothetically, millions of people, if we have to kill 100,000 people through firing squads to stop the spread, isn't that justified? And I think there's a lot of people who say that it is, or that they may not want to say it that way, but that is the implication of the argument. Now, what's interesting now is they've implemented all these really draconian measures, these quarantines, forcing everyone to go home and everything. And now they're saying that they've stopped the spread in China. And people are saying, see, you need the government to do that. Well, to that I'll add, they're also saying that the United States Army created it. So the stuff that the Chinese communists say are lies constantly. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't sometimes tell the truth or accidentally tell the truth, but I think that that's kind of naive to think that they have this under control. I think this is going to be a problem in China for a long time. They've staked their bet on it that this is pure propaganda for them. I say, well, that's China. Well, let's look at the United States now. All right, we don't have a one-party state. We don't have a police state, more or less, officially anyway. And I watched Donald Trump talk about this, and he is there's two things that he's doing, which people will attribute to him, but basically all politicians do this in Democratic states. A, it's not his fault, and he's not ultimately responsible for anything, even though he's the president and he's the head of the government, and supposedly the government is responsible for everything. B, he's awesome and he's done everything right, and we should be really grateful for what he's done to protect us. So there's this double whammy of you should be grateful, you should thank us, we're the best, you need us, blah, blah, blah. Also, ultimately, I'm not responsible. Anything bad that happens, not my fault, which I can understand if you're the mailman or, you're just a single beat cop or something like that. But if you're an elected official, then you start to bear some pretty direct responsibility at the highest level. And this is even true for lower ranking bureaucrats too, if maybe a lesser degree. What's funny, though, is like the Democrats are also doing this, right? The opposite side of the party. They're also coming out and trotting out their, oh, well, everything would be better if we were here. Now, in this particular case, I don't think that once this starts, once a disease like this exists, the chances that you contain it are very, very limited. And I love it how like the Democrats will say like, well, what we need is health insurance for unemployed. That's not the problem. The problem is that there aren't going to be enough hospital beds, and specifically there's not going to be enough ventilators or nurses or doctors. There's just not enough of them. Most people who get this will become sick but not need to be hospitalized. But among that fraction who do need to be hospitalized and do need to be put on ventilators, well, there's not enough of them, right? And so this is a problem that I think this is a potential problem with any system. In general, what you're talking about is a situation where the demand for a good suddenly and unexpectedly vastly outstrips supply, right? So this could happen with a famine if there was something that killed all the crops, or if there was a natural disaster that destroyed a lot of crops. We get this in microcosm during like hurricanes and stuff where you have power outages, and then the government cracks down on quote unquote scalpers who try and bring goods and services to people who need them. That's a whole other side topic here. But we have a situation, the estimates I've seen, that the United States has around 900,000 intensive care unit beds, which is enough to handle the typical day. But now that we're potentially seeing hundreds of thousands or even millions of people at a time needing them, that's going to, or several millions of people needing them, not just in one day, because most people who go onto these units on a ventilator, you don't just go for 5 hours, you might have to go for 2-3 weeks. that that's not going to be enough. Well, if they implement Medicare for all today, that will not increase the number of beds by one. That won't increase the number of ventilators by one. That won't increase the number of doctors by one or nurses by one. And it won't reduce the number of cases by one. So that won't do anything to solve the problem at all. The fact that you say, well, the government will then pay their bills. It doesn't matter if people pay or don't pay if there's not anything to buy. There aren't enough hospital beds to buy. Okay, now let's say that Obamacare, instead of being the clear, neoliberal pro-insurance company compromise that it was, and many people on the left recognize. Let's say that Obamacare was actually Medicare for all, right? The Bernie Sanders plan was implemented. That would not mean that there was one more hospital bed today than there would than there would otherwise be. There wouldn't be one more doctor. There wouldn't be one more ventilator. In fact, there's a good chance there'd be even fewer. All right, because there's no profit in it, there's no incentive in it. And this is something that people who want to talk about emotions, it's great. I mean, Bernie Sanders tweeted out that the coronavirus vaccine should be free if and when it's available. Right? Donald Trump made all these ridiculous claims about how it's going to be available soon, and it seems like best case scenario, it takes at least a year or maybe 18 months to develop vaccine if you're lucky, and if there's only one strain, which there's probably not going to be. So Donald Trump, ridiculous. Bernie Sanders, the opposite side of the political spectrum, the mirror of Donald Trump, right? The ethical left-winger. The vaccine should be free. Well, if you want to say there may be people out there who are rich enough, who are philanthropic and altruistic enough that they will be willing to try and develop a vaccine, which is not free, right? That takes resources, that takes time, that takes they might be willing to pay. Bill Gates might be willing to pay for it. He's done that for other illnesses, sure. But more people would be willing to do it if they could make money off of it, right? Like there's a bigger incentive to be a doctor if you can make a lot of money. There's a bigger incentive to create a vaccine if you can make a profit off it, right? It's just obvious. So I'm all fine with the altruism. That's fine. It's not even necessarily unreasonable to think that there wouldn't be some. I think that there would be some. There'll be more if you can make a profit on it. You still have people donating time and whatever, and then you can have people trying to make a profit, and the end result is that you have a bigger supply than you would otherwise have. And if we had Medicare for all starting 10 years ago, the situation could be much, much worse. The number of hospital beds could be 800,000 or 700,000. The number of ventilators could be even lower. There's no magic that says if the government pays, it's the better service, or there's a higher quantity. There's no incentive there for there to be a quantity of that. So the 2 points there, not so much a dig at government healthcare, but just the idea that the government's going to give itself credit no matter what, but it's not going to take responsibility no matter what, and that incentives really matter. And here's the general problem. I will concede the government can be very powerful. That the government can assume because it can tax, because it can legislate, and mostly because of the ideology of people just accepting its rule over them in a way that they don't accept the rule of the mob or the Catholic Church or the Boy Scouts. That's very powerful, and I do admit that. And what many people can't see, though, is that it's not enough to just have power, right? An asteroidal impact is powerful. An asteroid that strikes the Earth can be enormously powerful, and that's amazing. And we could say, well, you need that. Well, the problem is that power must be wielded both altruistically or beneficently, right? So you're assuming that the awesome power is not wielded for personal gain, and also it must be wielded in an intelligent way. Okay, so if we had a benevolent and an omniscient government, by all means, I would be a statist right away, right there. If that was a thing that existed in reality or ever had, I would be a statist. I wouldn't be an anarchist. I would say, look, we need, why wouldn't we? It's benevolent and it's omniscient. It knows everything that needs to be done, but it doesn't. The government is neither of those things. Not only is it neither of those things, it's not even, because you could say, well, that's a perfect example where I'm not talking about that, but pragmatically speaking, it knows what's best. Well, I don't think that that's correct, right? We have these alternating values out there. People value things differently. So there isn't necessarily a correct answer on what's best, right? And we can see this. I mean, you want to put don't be all principled and high pie in the sky. Let's just do what quote unquote works. Well, again, are we talking about just denying care to everybody over 70? Are we talking about um, completely closing the border? That was another funny thing is first they say Donald Trump is not reacting enough. Then he closes the border with China, and then they say he's racist. So, you know, and then a few weeks later, Joe Biden is saying, uh, when Trump closes the border with China, he says that's racist. He shouldn't do that. He's xenophobic. And then a few weeks later, he's saying he's not doing enough. Well, which is it? You know, and that's the other thing here. The government is the political process in a democracy is going to be, you know, who gets the most vote. It's a popularity contest. It's not a meritocracy on people who have the best policies. Right now we have Trump, who is, you know, probably a grifter, not principled, doesn't understand a lot of things. I think he's a smart guy. He knows how to please a crowd. He knows how to win a debate. He knows politics. Does he know epidemiology? No. Does he know virology? No. Does he understand the economy? Not really. Doesn't appear that way. So he doesn't know any of those things. But he has the skill sets that made him president. And then you have on the other side Joe Biden, who is clearly a senile, declining man. He has cognitive issues that are, you know, borderline Alzheimer's at this point. And one of them is going to be the runner of the government, or Bernie Sanders, who's even worse in a lot of ways. So this idea, well, there's people in the CDC. There are technological experts out there. Yes, there are technological experts. There are people who know a lot about diseases. They don't necessarily know a lot about everything else, and so they can't make balanced advices, right? They could say, well, this would be the best thing for dealing with a disease, but ignore every other condition. This is a very easy way where people will lower things down to one thing, and it would be like, what if they came out though and said, well, the best way to lower this disease is to ban all immigrants, close the border, build a wall, and then you'd be like, no, it's more complicated. They can't do that because that's racist or whatever. Okay, so clearly, in your estimation, there are other things that need to balance than just the virology. But the other problem is even the virologists who work for the state, you know, in the CDC, they're also bureaucrats. So there's a whole bunch of incentives there with being bureaucrats, right? We saw this in China where there's this strong incentive to say everything's fine or to pass blame onto somebody else. And this is what's been going on in the CDC. Pass blame or to say what they think needs to be said. They're beholden to political powers that are above them, right? They're not democratically elected. All the democratic power and force and authority is given to the president and the Congress, not to these bureaucrats. So they don't run the show, and they never will, right? And if you just want to pretend that they're going to be benevolent, that they know what's best for everybody, no, they don't. They might know a lot about this, but they don't know about everything. And they're not in power anyway, and there's no system where they will be in power. So, and never mind the fact that they could be corrupt, not just overtly corrupt in terms of grift and kickbacks and whatnot, but corrupt in the sense that their biases that they may sincerely adhere to can affect their judgment and change the way they look at the world and lead them astray from any kind of Benthamite, what's most good for the most people. So, no, since the government isn't capable of is neither of those things. It's neither benevolent or omniscient. I don't see why its great power is just fraught with abuse. It's going to misuse that power. It's perfectly reasonable if there's a threat that people understand, right? People realize that this is a serious issue, that they could get sick, that they could die, then they can take the steps. People can learn enough to socially isolate, and people are doing that on their own, far in advance of what the government's telling them to do. If they can't understand that, here's the catch-22. If they're too stupid, if they're so foolish that they don't know those things, what makes you think that they're wise enough to vote? Right? Like they're too dumb to question the government, but they're smart enough that they get to pick who runs it. This just does not make any sense. It's incoherent. Another thing is a lot of the things the government is doing are things that the government creates. So like, what's the number one thing that the government's done so far? It's closed the schools. Well, fuck, they're the ones who mandated people go to the schools in the first place. It's like, without the government, who would close all the government schools when there's a pandemic? Yeah, maybe there shouldn't be government schools in the first place. Actually, if there is a silver lining to this, and it's too early to talk about. Well, it's not too early. I'll speculate. Look, we don't know how bad this is going to get, so it may seem improper and at a future date. And I say this with that knowledge. So this is not to diminish the suffering and harm this is going to cause to millions of people, right? Millions of people are going to suffer from this. Probably hundreds of thousands of people are going to die. So this is a serious, serious thing. But I think, I mean, as it stands right now, most of the colleges and at least where I am have been canceled. People have gone home. They're doing online, or they're just extending break. For now, they're saying for a month or a couple days, but I'm gonna guess that's gonna get extended for at least the rest of the year. If they were lucky, they'll start in the fall, but I don't even know about that. And now it's cascading through the public schools themselves, the high schools, the middle schools, the elementary schools. Well, now they're doing online learning, and the question is going to be, well, wait a second, if we could do this, why are we being forced to go to these anyway, right? If we can just do this from home, I think a lot of people are going to become homeschoolers as a result of this, actually. When you have people, left-wing people who are taking their kids out to, quote, homeschool them, and doing it on their own recognizance, right? People were doing this way before the government told them to. Some people, not all people. Yeah. And I mean, I have lots of friends in college who are like, oh, I just got kicked out of my dorm, and like, you paid room and board for the whole semester. And I haven't heard about schools refunding anybody for any of that. And they're not going to. And people are like, well, why am I paying for room and board if you don't need it, if you can take an online class? Yeah, good question. Really good question. Oh, and here's another thing. I can't believe I was going to not mention this. Regulations are one of the reasons we have as many beds as we have, right? We have all these things from the FDA to the AMA. We have accreditation that limits the number of schools and the number of medical schools. We have limits on the number of staff. We have limits on the licenses to create the products. So you might argue that we need them because we need them for quality control, and most people have this belief, and it's literally a myth, that regulations come about because consumers who have been harmed by poor quality provision of goods and services, they marched to the government and they said, protect us from those horrible businesses, those rapacious, cutthroat capitalist businesses who are putting rat poison in the food and doing bad medical service and building bad products. And it's just everything that you got off the shelves is going to be deadly. And they went to the government and they said, please use the democratic power of the state to protect us from these rapacious capitalists. And then the do-gooder New Deal administration, filled with righteous might, what they went and they took it to the capitalists and they said, okay, you make sure there's no rat poison in your food because we know you've been putting that in all the food. And they're like, we were going to try and kill everyone with our rat poison. No, we can't because Upton St. Clair stopped us. Okay, that's... If you believe it's that's maybe a hyperbolic version, but if you believe any version of that, you don't know fuck all about the reality, okay? So policy is set by special interests. Special interests are filled with the producers. They use regulations to their advantage. Does that mean every producer ever has had every regulation it's ever wanted? No, of course not. But they form associations for this purpose. They lobby for this purpose. And while you might like a like or retweet a tweet, they're spending millions of dollars and have been year by year, every year for 100 years to shape policy. And they shape policy to destroy their competition. And they do it to raise their prices, right? When the AMA goes and asks for licensure, the AMA is not asking for licensure by going, hey, we suck at being doctors, we're dangerous, we kill people all the time, please regulate us because we can't trust ourselves. No, they want them to please regulate them so they can restrict the number of doctors, restrict the number of people who can provide medical services, and so that the members of the AMA can raise prices and charge more than they otherwise would. They go to the state and they say, hey, you should regulate us. And then the congressmen go, we don't know anything about being a doctor. We don't know anything about your industry. Oh, well, that's fine. We'll advise you, and we'll have an advisory council, and we'll have lobbyists come and tell you this is what the best thing to do is. Oh, and by the way, you have a re-election campaign coming up. That's great. Oh, you need regulators? Well, you don't know anyone who knows about this, but look, here's the former head of the AMA, and he would be a great person to run the regulatory. Oh, okay, wow. Boom, boom, boom. And now doctors have an oligopoly, and they can charge more than they could otherwise would. And you could make the argument, it's a totally intellectually honest argument, and say, well, if it raises the quality, which it doesn't necessarily do, right? It's there to help the producers, not to necessarily raise the quality for the consumers, but that's a hypothetical possibility. Well, but then the cost of that is there's fewer doctors. And that's a big thing. Just by itself, that's a big thing. That's a huge thing. If we had 200,000 more doctors in the United States right now, that would be a big help. If we had 1 million more doctors in the United States right now, that would be a big help. But the same thing is true with nurses. The same thing is true for lab techs. The same thing is true for the number of hospitals. The same thing is true for the number of hospital beds. The same thing is true for the number of hospital bed makers. You think you can just go and oh, I know how to build a test. I have the skill to build a piece of furniture that could serve as a bed in a hospital. You know how many people or corporate people have the ability to do that, or would have the ability to assemble the capital to be able to do that? It's a lot. It's a lot. But they wouldn't be permitted. Not only are they not now permitted to do that, they wouldn't have been permitted to do that. And if they had this all along, there would be more. That's the other thing. Oh, that who else but the government would be able to cancel the government schools? Yes, and who else but the government would be able to relax the FDA regulations on new drugs? Right? Why does it have to take 10 years and $1 billion to develop a drug? Do we want to wait 10 years for a drug that could help people, right? Instead of only having enough respirators, if there was a drug that maybe doesn't cure the virus, but alleviates the symptoms enough that you don't suffocate, or helps your pneumonia symptoms so you don't have to go, wouldn't that be wonderful? Wouldn't that be great? Wouldn't that be amazing? Well, if it takes 10 years, they're like, well, the government's dramatic action will now lower the rates. Okay, lower the requirements. Why aren't they lower all the time? No, I'm not saying, because I don't know, no one knows, that if we had had a free market, there would have been enough beds that this could easily be absorbed. Depending on the magnitude, this is going to be a shock, right? If the demand goes up 10 times than it normally does, that's going to be a problem. Absolutely. But there is absolutely, just as easily, no question that the regulations and the restrictions, whether they be taxes or whatever it is, and even if you want to assume that there's no that it's not a regulatory capture and that it's not rent seeking and it's all just there to protect the consumers, which is a total fairy tale, but you can believe that if you want. Every step of the way, that's reducing the supply. So the supply is much less than it would otherwise be. How much? Is it 10 times less? I don't know. I can't say that. Probably not, but who knows? But there would be more. It would be easier. The system would be more streamlined and receptive to new innovations. Well, we want it to be innovative. We don't want to just say, here, government, you take care of everything because you have all the power and you have all the democratic authority. And so we're just going to hope that you get it right, because God, we all know Donald Trump and Joe Biden can be trusted with that, or the Communist Party of China, or whoever. I mean, people seem to project that, well, I think I would do it right, so I imagine myself getting elected, so I support a government. Well, no, okay, you don't know what's right for everybody, and that's not how the government works. So it's government that's in the way, and the big thing, the big action that it's taking is to get out of the way a little bit in some marginal ways, which is good. I'm glad that it is reducing the regulations on some FDA drugs. I just wish that they hadn't been restricting the supply for so long. For all we know, every Walmart in the country could have a ventilator that you could rent, on the back. And maybe it wouldn't be the best ventilator ever, but it certainly would be better than nothing, right? For all we know, every drugstore in the country could be selling generic drugs that were developed a year ago or 2 years ago. That they did testing and it's pretty safe, but they didn't go through the FDA testing that takes 10 years and $1 billion. And you know what? There would be way more drugs on the market. There definitely would be more drugs. Would one of them be a miracle drug? Yeah, I guess it's possible. Not very likely, but it could happen. Would some of those drugs be helpful? Probably some of them might, yeah. And you start adding, again, you add this all together, and it's just a radically different situation. It's a radically better situation. We're not forcing people to be together by going to school. We're not forcing people to not become doctors and not become nurses and to not have medical. This is a demand that people have, that their supply is restricted because the government restricts it. Because it's good for the existing providers because of special interests. Now they can't say that, so they teach you in school, and the government-run schools that they're now saying you don't have to go to suddenly. The reason is because of Upton St. Clair and because of The Jungle, which is a fictional novel, by the way. So They're self-serving. They're short-sighted. You know, what's the next election? This is the whole thing. This is why they're doing it in China. They want to be popular. They don't want to say that there's a problem. So they persecuted people who said there's a problem. And now they didn't persecute people who said that, but they played it down. They said, "Oh no, it's fine. We only have 10 cases." Sure, we only did 10 tests, and 100% of the people we tested had it, but that was only 10. It's not that much. What's the big deal? Blah, 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 blah. Go out, help the economy, and then they do a bailout, billionaire bailout. Hey, I just did my taxes. I had to send them money. Fuck. I mean, they said they did a bailout for the oil industry. I didn't get that money. I mean, it's ridiculous. They're doing they're paying out billions, right? And this is the other thing. Oh, you don't like Biden, you don't like Trump. You know, good old Obama though. You trust him? Yeah, he's Mr. Bailout too. He's Mr. Bailout, giving it to the billionaires, right? Not the little guy. Oh, you think that the fact that they can expand the money supply is going to help at all? If they expand the money supply, that there'll be more hospital beds? You think the virus is going to you think the virus is going to go away because the GDP goes up because they spend it? Nope. Look, this is a horrible thing, this disease. It really is. And any system would struggle under it. Any free market system would struggle under this. But the idea that the government is going to be able to protect you, no, it doesn't have the knowledge to protect you. It doesn't know what's best for everybody. It's not even, not only does it not know, it's seriously not even thinking about that. It seriously doesn't. The number one thing that a politician is thinking about is how to get reelected. All right. And that means that's social, that's virtue signaling, that's showing their wokeness, that's showing their strength. So now Shinny the Pooh in China is going around pretending like he solved this problem. And when they undo some of the lockdowns and it starts to spread again, they will persecute those people just like they did before. And they will tell anyone who's, and does that make any sense from a Benthamite, what's best, most good for the most people? Well, I don't think it does, but the problem with that is that doesn't really mean anything, right? There are people who believe that if you get elected president or whatever, that whatever you then decide is manifestly the will of the people, you know, because you won the election, even though the electoral process is clearly rigged and clearly full of, like, it's subject to enormous influence from special interests from highly powerful elite groups, right? It's not just democracy manifesting itself. It never has been. It never will be. Nor could it ever be. It's also a problem with the left too, where they believe in technocracy and democracy. Those are, in many instances, in fact, in most instances, those are mutually exclusive things. The majority of people can believe and vote in a way that the experts, the technocrats, don't agree with. So what do you do, Neil deGrasse Tyson? Are you going to do what the people vote for, or are you going to do what you think is best for everybody? Sauron.